topic is, of course, travel before the railway came to the valley. This was, of course, this valley was quite isolated for many years. Isolated not to the natives that traveled it in the old days, but it was isolated to the newcomers, the white men, who were looking for their fortunes. And there had been sort of allusions to the trappers and things, but this wasn't a good area, so it was difficult to get to, so they stuck to the more lucrative areas, such as the interior. At any rate, here we go with Grassy Trails. Back in the old days, before 1858, there wasn't a lot of traffic in the area. Our natives had trails for hunting and trading, and they crisscrossed the area. They led to the coast and as far as the interior as the Kootenays. Things are pretty much the same for hundreds of years.
Until 1846, when Sir James Douglas sent William Caulfield Anderson on a mission to find a quicker route to the coast for the fur traders.
This was sparked by the uneasy Americans to the south, who were claiming all of the territory to the 54th parallel. And you've heard reference to this with the 54-40-year fight. That was their claim. England was not too interested in the mainland, as it had most of its operations on Vancouver Island. It was a very busy place with coal, lumber, and the fish over there.
But the threat of losing the lucrative fur trade spurred a call to action. A new route that didn't take them down the Columbia River to the ocean had to be found.
Rumors of gold in the Fraser River started bringing gold seekers from Oregon and California in 1857. There weren't many British supporters in the lower mainland, but it was still considered British territory.
Fearing that this land could be lost to the hordes of Americans coming north and turning it into a lawless new frontier, Douglas set up shop in Fort Langley and established rule and order.
One of the very first items of business was to get the miners out of the towns and into the gold bars. He decided to build a road up Anderson's route on the Harrison-Lillooet rivers, and he even charged the Americans for the privilege of building this road.
It wasn't just gold that attracted the newcomers. All kinds of businesses followed the gold seekers, and the lure of profit from supplying them was almost irresistible.
Let's just listen in on this humble couple who operate a small farm near New Westminster as they contemplate a bold move to perhaps improve their fortunes.
Did I hear you right? You expect me to pack up my things, give up my warm house with its new stove, and travel on a road that hasn't been built yet to go to Pemberbush?
That's Pemberton.
Whatever, Pemberton. Then don't interrupt. We're gonna live in a tent, raise vegetables for a bunch of no-account gold seekers?
Exactly right, that's right. You've got it.
Well then, Smarty, how would we even get there?
Well, there's a steamboat that would take us up from Fort Langley to Harrison Mills, and then it would take us all the way up to Port Douglas.
Are we there yet?
Then, if we're lucky, we can catch a wagon to a place called 29 Miles.
29 miles from nowhere.
Well, it's where the boat docks. We get on the boat, travel up the Lillooet Lake. Then we can hire some Indian packers and they'll take us 5 or 6 miles up the valley to beautiful, rich farmland.
And then?
We can start farming. Next year we can just watch the money roll in.
How much?
Lots. Everybody has got to eat. Why? Tomatoes are 75 cents each. A pound of bacon sells for 80 cents. Why? One farmer made $500 an acre on potatoes alone.
Wow! In a few years we could be rich.
Yes, sirree.
Well, just count me in. Just one condition.
What's that?
Promise me I won't have to walk.
Walk? Oh, I promise you that this area is going to grow so fast and people will move in here by, why, there'll be a railroad here in just a few years.
A railroad up there?
Yes, and that'll make a whole new market for our products.
And you think this will happen?
Mark my words.
Well, I hope you're right.
And so, the first farmers moved into the area. It was a difficult trip in with the boats, wagons, more boats, canoes, and horses. But they still came, in spite of the long distances and the many stopping houses along the way, some with only a blanket on a dirt floor. They pushed on to the lure of gold.
The gold fever and rush was over by 1865. The new Yale to Clinton wagon road spelled the end of the Lillooet Lakes route. But some of the farmers stayed on to homestead. The reason for the popularity of the new route was obvious.
On the Harrison-Douglas Trail, the time to get to Quesnel took over 20 days. Then it called. You took a steamer to Port Douglas. You got on a wagon ride to 29 Mile. You got on another steamer to Port Pemberton. You got on another wagon ride and went overland to Port Anderson. Then you took a steamer to Seton Portage, the BC's first railway, and took a 3-mile ride to another steamer on Anderson Lake. And that took you to Lillooet. When you were there, and you're still in one piece, you took a wagon ride to Lillooet, or to Quesnel.
That was some involved trip. The Yale route was much faster. A steamer took you to Yale, you boarded a wagon, and you headed north. 4 or 5 days later, you were in Quesnel. Much, much quicker.
In the meantime, almost everyone had left Pemberton and the area.
The rumblings of building a railroad north to Lillooet were already being heard. This would start at Newport, now known as Squamish, and while this was going on in 1873, a cattle trail was begun to connect the interior to Burrard Inlet. This was to supply cattle to the lucrative city markets.
One branch of the trail left to Squamish, down the Mamquam to the mouth of the Seymour River.
Another took the route down the Cheakamus River to Squamish.
The trail followed the original railroad survey along the lakes and cost $5,100.
The trail was meant to provide access for the West Fraser cattle to the markets of the lower mainland. Cattlemen, seeing the vast sums spent on the trail, sensed they could cash in on these improvements and make a lot of money doing it. This is how it might have gone.
Well, now, Hank, this looks like luck is on our side this time.
That was pretty smart lobbying to get the government to build that trail along the lakes.
And now we have a direct route, and getting our cattle to Vancouver should be a snap.
Why, we should get at least $100 a head.
Well, I figured $20 to get them there, and we can make $8,000 for every 100 head we deliver.
This is definitely a good time to be in the cattle business.
Hey, you say that again. But it was so rough and so long that most cattle broke legs or fell into the canyons.
Only one formal cattle drive was held and most of the cattle died. Those that did survive had to be put to pasture to recuperate.
So in the meantime, the railroad had reached Port Moody and linked BC with the rest of Canada. But what about Pemberton?
Hey, look at this.
What is it?
I thought you said they were doing a survey for the railroad.
Well, I did, and that's what they did.
I don't see no train, just a bunch of dumb cows.
Yeah, you have to be patient. It takes time to build a railroad.
Well, it better be quick. I'm not getting any younger. It was the same old story. You could leave Vancouver and travel to Squamish by steamer. Then you had the choice of riding a horse or walking to Pemberton.
Or you could still take the boat to Port Douglas, take a wagon to 29 Mile, and then try to find a native with a canoe to take you to Pemberton. A much harder trip.
The Oblate priests made this trip for years and ministered to the locals along this route. There were quite ornate churches in all the communities, and the priests would stay for 2 to 3 weeks in each community.
Marcus Smith arrived with a survey party in 1873, and the speculation was rampant. Finally,
there might be a way to tap the riches of the interior.
There were two possible routes to the interior. The first would head up the valley to the Hurley Pass and then into the interior of the province. The second was to go along the lakes to Lillooet and on to the Fraser.
Most supporters favored the Pemberton route through the Hurley.
Much land was staked out, and the valley was divided into farmlands. These could be preempted for $18 an acre versus $45 an acre for preemptions in the Fraser Valley.
In the meantime, if you wanted goods, you had to pack them on a horse over the Pemberton Trail. This was still difficult and very expensive.
Roads, such as they were, consisted of wagon tracks across the fields. Most were impassable in the spring thaw.
Well, where was the railway? Well, in 1907, 10 miles had been surveyed in Squamish. By 1909, 60 miles to Pemberton had been surveyed.
In 1911, the Howe Sound and Northern had proposed two town sites, one in Newport, which was Squamish, and the other in Egerton, which was Pemberton. The railway company subdivided this farm area and offered it at $100 to $150 an acre.
Construction started in 1912 and headed to Pemberton. A rough road was built on the right-of-way to haul in supplies for the camps along the way. Equipment was brought down from Prince Rupert by barge after the completion of the Grand Trunk Pacific Railway.
Most of the roadbed in the Cheakamus followed the old Pemberton Trail. Things were looking good for Pemberton.
Hey, that's a pretty good looking map.
It's just been finished, and the entire property has been subdivided and approved.
Old John Curry just died last year. How'd you manage to get it preserved and surveyed and approved so fast?
Don't ask. But it's done. And when they start building the railway north, we'll both be very rich men.
I hear that just about the whole valley is staked out.
That's right, all the way up to where they cross the river.
I hear that someone even started building a station up there. Poured the foundation and everything.
It's probably a good move. He'll get the jump on everyone.
Flash to 1913.
Did you hear the latest news?
Hear what?
The railroad's not coming here.
What? Coming up the valley?
No, the company decided to follow the lake route to go to Lillooet.
But what about our subdivision? Our plans for community? All of our dreams for this big community in Egerton?
I guess it was all for nothing, I'm sorry.
10 years of work, gone in an instant.
When the decision was made to follow the lake route and not the Hurley, nobody knows why that decision was made.
There are claims that the Hurley had too much snow and would be a problem in the winter.
The lake route was level, but was along treacherous bluffs with broken rock. However, this was the route that was chosen.
All that remains of the Hurley routes are names of mountains: Caboose Mountain, Semaphore Mountain, and Railway Pass.
There is a story that speculators built a foundation for the station on the old Perkins farm up the valley in anticipation of the rail line, which would soon be constructed.
The dream of Pemberton land selling for $500 to $1,000 an acre when the railway came to town was a bust.
Until the railway arrived in 1914, people still had to come in the hard way on the old Pemberton Trail or up the Harrison-Lillooet route, but they could travel to Lillooet by train and come by the lake route.
On October the 29th, 1914, the first train arrived in Pemberton.
Finally, there was a link with the coast and a much cheaper way of bringing in goods and shipping out farm products.
So now the boom could begin, and the real change was about to occur in this peaceful valley. Hey! Wake up! Wake up!
What's the matter? Is there another flood?
No! The train! The train!
More rain? God, it's wet enough already. We don't need any more rain.
No! The railroad train! It's finally here! I told you we'd be getting a railway one day.
About time. I hope it brought my pension check.
And so, the era of hard travel came to an end. Gone was the risky travel on rocky, steep trails.
Gone was the isolation from the deep winter snows as the train ran most of the year.
Finally, a reliable and cheap, convenient form of transportation brought the Pemberton area into the rest of the world.
And another first for Pemberton in 1914, the valley roads finally had gravel spread on the dirt surface. It was a new beginning. Grassy Trails no longer. This district lot 164, 165 was one of the first preemptions in the valley. It was John Curry and his partner Dougal, and they came in I think John Curry came in the 1890s. He died in 1910 and it became the Neal Farm, and within a year it was subdivided into 74 lots. So that was Pemberton's first major development. There was a group of settlers that came with the gold rush right after the gold rush in 1860, and some of the first privately held lands on the mainland were in Pemberton. So one of the first preemptors was P. Smith and Company, and these guys followed the gold rush. So they ended up going all the way up to the Caribou, but they ran the first general store at Port Pemberton, and they ran, I think, a mill up in Lillooet, and then they continued to push north with the gold rush. Another first preemptor was Scotty Halliday, James Scotty Halliday, and there was a murder in Pemberton. Tom Poole was murdered in 1879, and the remaining settlers at that time were all implicated in Tom Poole's murder. Tom was murdered and his children were murdered with him, and the stopping house was burned down. And the thought at the time was this had happened because Tom would be accepting gold for staying over, and he may have had gold under the floorboards. But anyway, the coroner and magistrate came down from Lillooet. This was the first major criminal investigation in the area. And after that, everybody left. Scotty Halliday included, and there was only one person left in the area, and the name was Macbeth. It was shortly after that that John Curry arrived. So there were some people prior to John Curry, but there's no remnants of them today in the area. During the railway speculation years, like the railway station foundation that was built at the top of the valley, there was also some entrepreneurial Chinese people, and I don't know what the names were. There's just a mention of this in the history book, but they built quite an elaborate stopping house somewhere way up the Lillooet River in the woods, and the remnants of that could be seen through until about the 1940s in the area, but there'd be nothing left now.
You know, getting back to travel with pack trains, we don't appreciate just how difficult that was. A mule pack train would usually average about 10 miles a day. And when you come to see our special on Cadillac Jack, you'll understand why. But a horse pack train could do a little bit more, 15 to 20. But the reason is that they could only work the horses so hard they had to stop, water them and feed them, and then load them up again the next day and then take off again. So this is one of the reasons why there are stopping houses all so many places, because the people on the wagons could travel 20, 30, 40 miles a day, but the people who are walking and actually taking the horses or the mules with them had to rest much more often. And it was a tough haul for all of them. But it gives us some sort of sense of just how difficult travel was. And when you compare it to the 4 days from Yale to Quesnel, I mean, that's still quite a long way, a couple of 100 miles, and they could travel 60, 70 miles a day on a stage. And again, a reason for having so many changing houses along the way that they had fresh horses every 8 or 10 miles. Yeah, it was a pretty complicated transportation system back in the old days.
Somebody told me that Mr. Perkins, that lived way out in the, used to walk all the way to Squamish.
Yeah.
He actually, there's a story, one of my favorite stories is Bert Perkins, Herbert Perkins, he went with Bert, took a bet that he could outrace a horse, because there was a dance in Squamish. So there was a man on a horse and Bert Perkins on foot. Well, Bert Perkins beat that guy by close to a day, He actually got to the dance, played the mouth harp all night long, and the fellow arrived in the morning, and Bert was just about ready to go to bed.
There's another good story about him when he first got married. He didn't have a stove here. So he packed, they say, they packed the stove in on his back for his wife.
Yeah, because his wife wouldn't follow him to Pemberton unless she had a cook stove.
Unless she had a cook stove, yeah. They were tough in those
Boy, they were tough.
Yeah, it was a pretty interesting time, you know, even when you consider the first cars couldn't really travel over the roads. I mean, the railroad was the mainstay of the community. In fact, Brent Pike ran a freight service here for years. And he had a little truck with a box on it, and he would get the freight and deliver it. And everything was shipped by rail. If you wanted to bring your car in, there was a flat deck, and you tied your car to the railway car, and they brought it up on the train, and that's how they got things here.
I guess we just need to explain though, there was a road system within the valley of Pemberton from about 1910 onwards, and it continually got improved, though some of the early government officials said there is nothing that makes that worthy of being called a road. I guess there was grass growing up in the middle of it. It wasn't
Yeah.
passable most times of the year.
Yeah.
But there always was a road system within Pemberton, just not to Pemberton.
Yeah, well, you have to remember back when they built the fish hatchery, the turn of the century, that all of this stuff was still using bits and pieces of the Douglas Trail to from Port Anderson to Birkenhead, and so you know there were roads up and down, and they were all interconnected. There were bridges, and there were people that floated across and logs and ferries. I mean, they were quite ingenious, and they worked very hard at what they did. But you could move around, but it wasn't easy.
So what year is the highway finished?
Finished?
Yeah, what year did it?
Well, you could first drive. The first winter you could drive out here was 1966.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah. You could drive the highway in 1965, but they didn't plow it in the winter.
Okay.
But in 1966 they did try to keep it open. What's interesting is that the railway, prior to the railway, it was pretty much a player up until about the mid-70s. And as soon as they started shipping logs and things by truck, because the road was so much improved, then the railway just pretty much lost its importance for this area. And the excitement with the railway was, of course, the Bud car, where you could watch all the passengers come and go. But that was a good service.
Well, the reason we wanted to do this story this year is because next year is the 100th anniversary of the arrival of the railroad. So we wanted to talk about what life was like before the railroad this year, so that next year we'll tell you all about the exciting life that began for settlers after the coming of the railroad.